Okay, again, good to see you all again tonight. Let's go into the slides and get grounded to where we were the last time that we met a week ago. They had a thing on the news tonight about it being kind of 1 year from when the pandemic started. And of course, this was about the time when we stopped doing our in-person teachings up in Taos. It's been a year because I think this was the week, yeah, where I didn't go up to Taos. A number of the members had already expressed some concern about the group meeting. And I think TNL shut down that following weekend. So anyway, we've been dealing with it for a year. We can all rejoice that we're all still here, but nonetheless, kind of take in the reality of what we've had to deal with in this world, through this past year. I've got a few little slides that give some kind of something to meditate on or think about in terms of our motivation for engaging in this type of practice and studying this text. This is from the book that's called The Wheel of Sharp Weapons, which is by Geshe Ngawang Dargye. It's his commentary on this text. Quite a few years ago it was written, but he says the Kadampa Lamas, remember the Kadampa Lamas are those who came from the Kadampa tradition, which was about 1,000 years ago when Lama Atisha came to Tibet. He left these amazing teachings of the Lojong genre with his heart disciple Dontompa. And Dontompa then went on to begin what became the lineage of the Kadampa Geshes or the Kadampa Lamas. And this is, again, what we are following in regard to this text, this being an Indian text, but nonetheless one that very much influenced Atisha and the teachings that he left behind in Tibet 1,000 years ago. So the Kadampa Lampa said that mind training, again, Lojong, is the treasure of all attainments. If we never try to train our mind, it will be oversensitive, too easily swayed in joy, and too easily depressed. So certainly, talking about the last year, we all needed to have some measure of mind training to survive all of this, to be kind of riding the waves of various things happening. A lot of negative changes, certainly, wasn't without its joyful events, but nonetheless, if we weren't able to keep some sort of even-mindedness through all of that, no doubt we did find it challenging. So mind training comes into great value no matter what is going on in the world around us. The slightest change, he says, can be overwhelming if we are without mind training. However, if we are familiar with it, we can, when harm befalls us, I should say meditate, sorry, not mediate, meditate that suffering is the nature of cyclic existence and somehow remain undisturbed. That we can see that this is the nature of cyclic existence, that it's arising through its various causes and conditions as we're exploring in these verses. We can simply have an understanding of it, that this is typical for samsara to have these sorts of things going on. It might not be typical for our world to have what's transpired over the past year, but this is the nature of samsara. This is where when we live under the control of these causes and conditions that bring about suffering, our own karma and delusions. Well, it's inevitable that we're going to have to experience that. It's inevitable that beings in the world have to experience that. But even that level of understanding is some kind of way of mind training, some way of applying these teachings and seeing that we can actually have a very different mind in the space of whatever is happening, all the changes we have to go through. So again, we're in this section of the text, verses 10 through 48, which are still within the conventional bodhicitta teachings, and we will have quite a bit after this that's still within that topic. Remember that conventional bodhicitta overcomes the demon of self-cherishing. And then we'll go on to ultimate bodhicitta, which is the wisdom realizing emptiness, which overcomes the self-grasping that is, again, the deeper error that we're making in our minds, the root of our suffering. So again, this section is called Karmic Cause and Effect and Their Antidotes. This is, again, a very famous section of this text in particular because it goes through and has a refrain around, what is everything being the result of our own past actions of the past coming around to ripen in our lives and how we have to learn something from that and do something different. That is the, again, format for this. I won't belabor this because we've had a couple of classes now where we've gone through and these verses in this section all the way through verse 45, which we'll probably make it up to tonight or somewhere around there. Line A is the specific results of suffering that we are talking about. Line B is understanding it's your karma through the refrain of, this is the wheel of sharp weapons, da 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 da. Then line C, giving the specific cause for what we must have sent out that is now coming coming home to roost. And then the specific remedy, that is how we actually work with this. So we learn something from these karmic occurrences and actually do something different. And again, as I mentioned in the motivation, not just for our own benefit. We do this because we want to be able to benefit others. We want to be able to open our hearts to their suffering. We want to be able to practice Tonglen. And again, hopefully you've been working with the Tonglen meditation during these weeks with this course, and that will continue to be something that you will find useful. Besides practicing Tonglen, again, also try to enact the specific remedy, especially if you are finding that what's being described is something that's going on in your life, and then purify any past negativities, even if you don't think it's going on in your life right now. Well, no doubt we've done every one of these things that are being mentioned, all the various causes in these verses. We've probably committed many, many times in countless lifetimes. So we have to purify our negativities on a daily basis if we can, using the four opponent powers, which again I spoke to previously. All right, so let's get into the very next verse. This is verse number 35. We left off here last time. This verse says, whenever we wander powerlessly in a foreign place, it is the sharp weapons of bad actions turning against us for having evicted lamas and others from their dwellings. Now we should no longer banish anyone from any place. So the idea here is that, again, we might be experiencing a result that's very similar to the cause in this case. When we're sort of wandering powerlessly and we don't have an ability to maybe have a place to stay or to be taken care of, what have you, it's because we've done that same thing to others. Recall that that's one of the most common results that we're going to see. There are 4 different types of results that we can experience from a complete action that we've committed. There's the ripening result, which is the actual rebirth that you get, or sometimes called the fruitional result. And if you've created negative karma, it would be one of the lower rebirths. If you've created positive karma, it would be one of the higher rebirths. Then within that existence, or possibly in future existences, you are also creating 2 results that are similar to the cause. One is in terms of your experience, which again is the main one that we're seeing verse after verse. There will be one coming up tonight that's more about environmental results. But nonetheless, we can see that most of what these verses are talking about is you've done a particular type of action that comes back to you in a very similar way. So that if you've been deceitful towards others, then others begin to deceive you. They lie to you and hold the truth back from you and what have you. And then the other result that's similar to the cause is the one in terms of our behavior, which of course is what we're always trying to combat through these antidotes, is to stop engaging in that behavior, because every time we engage in a particular behavior that's negative, we plant the seed for that to happen again and again and again. We have a tendency to do those things by virtue of our habit. Then the 4th result is the one I mentioned that we will see a verse to tonight. I think it's the next verse, where we have the environmental results. Even what we experience in our environment is a product of our karma. So again, in this one, it's mostly the idea that we have a result coming into our lives that's very similar to what we did in the past. Let's look at what Geshe Jampa Gyatso says in his text. This is page 14, I believe. Let me page down here. 14 of the commentary that you should have. I've got to scroll up just a little bit now. So it says here, when, due to being evicted like a servant by a lord and so forth, the suffering arises of having to, without wishing to, powerlessly wander in a distant foreign place, think that this is retribution for in previous rebirths, when we had very great power, evicting even our own lama and others, and not allowing them to reside in their dwellings. So why do we have this karma of being blocked to having a good place to stay, to be taken care of again, to have everything kind of fall into place for us? It's because we've been an obstacle to others in terms of their dwellings, them having safety and roof over their head, what have you. It is also retribution for having banished others from a place. For example, at the very least, this would have been when the weather was cold, we did not allow others to stay in the sun, but sent them away. Therefore, from now on, we should not banish any type of person at all from his or her dwelling, and we should meditate on taking and giving. Geshe Gyatso, my teacher in Italy, when he taught on this, he said, even when it comes to like, animals, as much as possible, we shouldn't upset their dwellings, the places where they abide. So like ant hills and what have you that are the colonies underneath and what have you, as much as possible, we shouldn't disturb the dwellings of beings because we'll be creating a similar type of karma. But this whole little phrase here about, not allowing others to stay in the sun, but sent them away, not having kind of a warm place to stay or whatever, reminded me of a story that I'd heard about St. Francis, and I've got a little version of it. Maybe you've heard this story before, but he was walking with his brothers somewhere in Italy or what have you, and Brother Leo was kind of pushing Brother Francis to kind of give an answer to the question, what is perfect joy? And Brother Francis, St. Francis, like kept listing all these things that you would think would be joy, doing God's work and what have you. And he said, that's not perfect joy. And then eventually Brother Leo, kind of, let me read I'm going to read the version of it here, which actually comes from a man named Rich Heffern. It's from a Catholic website, but he says here, as they walked, Francis kept adding to this litany, describing places where perfect joy would not be found. Finally, after several miles, it is said that Brother Leo wondered much within himself and then blurted out, I pray thee, teach me wherein is perfect joy. And Brother Francis, thinking perhaps, I thought you'd never ask, answered Leo, and this is how he answered him. He said, if, when we shall arrive at our destination, all drenched with rain and trembling with cold, all covered with mud and exhausted from hunger, if when we knock at the convent gate, the porter should come angrily and ask us who we are, if after we have told him we are two of the brethren, he should answer angrily, what you say is a lie. You are two impostors going about deceiving the world and taking alms from the poor. Be gone, I say. It's okay, this is what's happened. He's envisioning this as like when they get to their destination, weary from their travel, drenched in rain, that they're going to be greeted by this, kind of being turned away from a place of warmth and safety in a similar way to the karma we're talking about here. It says here, if then the porter refused to open to us and leave us outside, exposed to the snow and rain, suffering from cold and hunger until nightfall. Then, if we accept such injustice, such cruelty and contempt with patience, without being ruffled and without murmuring, believing with humility and charity that the porter really knows us, and he says essentially, if you kind of trust in all of that, he says, write down, Brother Leo, this is perfect joy. And he goes on and says, and Francis wouldn't leave it alone, adding further, and if we knock again, and the porter comes out in anger to drive us away with oaths and blows, as if we were vile impostors, saying, be gone, miserable robbers, for here you shall neither eat nor sleep. If we accept all this with patience, with joy, and with charity, O Brother Leo, write that this indeed is perfect joy. I think there's even a version of it where he does it one more time, of knocking on the door and being turned away. But the idea is that this is, as far as I can tell, St. Francis was practicing Lojong, right? Kind of recognizing that it would be better to kind of work with all of that and receive that type of harm and not in any way want to retaliate, not in any way want to create the same type of karma. To recognize that this experience of being turned away of while you're traveling, going from monastery to monastery as they must have been, you know, even though they should have been easily recognized and welcomed in, the opposite happened. Well, I mean, he could see that, again, I don't know that Brother Francis believed in karma, but there was something within him that knew that the correct response to that is to be charitable, to be patient, to be kind in the midst of others doing something that would be so blatantly, disregarding who they were, rather than, well, can't you tell I'm, Brother Francis, this is Brother Leo and blah, 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 and really being adamant and mean and whatever. So anyway, I that story was one that it's interesting. I heard that story for the very first time in Italy when I was up in Padua. Lama Zopa Rinpoche did a talk up there one night, and all of us traveled all the way up there. I think we spent the night up in Padua, but we had a wonderful evening with Rinpoche. And one of the people in the audience mentioned this story about Saint Francis, and I had never heard it before. But I think St. Francis again was somebody pretty highly evolved, if not a bodhisattva, Buddha, who knows what. But he essentially did see that there are different ways to practice. And of course, this is what Christ was talking about in so many of his teachings, right? When he said, if somebody slaps you on the right cheek, well, then turn them the left and say, okay, you can slap there too. How many people really practice that way, whether they're Christian or not? Even Buddhist practitioners, that's very hard to do, obviously. That's what we're learning in this text, is to not engage in the same behavior that's going to cause you to have the same obstacles, these karmic obstacles that keep ripening in more and more suffering experiences, and we keep reacting in the same way. So maybe that's enough on that for tonight. I might mention in the commentary of this that His Holiness gave when he taught on the Wheel of Sharp Weapons, which I actually have a DVD of those teachings. Really quite nice to watch and see how His Holiness presents this material. He said that actually Milarepa, in the early part of his life, he was often expelled from teachings by Marpa, who was his guru. And when he first began studying with him, that Marpa would just send him away and say, no, you can't be here, kind of kicking him out. So again, he must have had some of that karma he needed to purify. And instead of, again, retaliating, he endured it. And eventually all of the teachings were open to him with his guru Marpa. So this is any way that we're sort of shutting anyone off from anything that would bring about their well-being in a temporal way or in a more ultimate way. If we do that, we're creating an identical experience for ourselves, to have obstacles to our own well-being, whether we're traveling, whether we're just living day to day, whether we're trying to obtain various things that will help us on our spiritual path. So, okay, so that's probably, again, good enough on that verse. Here's where I was reminding myself to tell that story. It's a wonderful little picture I found of St. Francis with all these beautiful animals around him. Anyway, let's go on to the next verse. This is verse 36. Whenever the unwanted, such as frost, hail, and so on, occurs, it is the sharp weapons of bad actions turning against us for not having properly guarded our pledges and morality. Now we should keep our pledges and the like pure. So again, sometimes we will hear these verses where as far as I know, I've never really heard this kind of correlation between maintaining your pledges, your samaya with your gurus, and having these environmental results. But nonetheless, these environmental results do seem to have some correlation with how much we've maintained our morality. Recall, as I said earlier, that the environmental results are a product of our karma frequently, and it doesn't even have to be a complete karma to create that type of environmental experience. And in this case, to have like all of these things that get in the way of having good crops, all the environment that we need to support, a good livelihood and what have you. These things are all part of this result that we're experiencing. And therefore, where is it coming from? According to these teachings, it's coming from our having broken our pledges. Whoops. I want to go down there. Let's look at what Geshe-Jampa Gyatso says in his brief commentary. He says, whenever crops and so forth are not harvested due to the arising of the unwanted, such as frost and hail, as well as weeds, insects, drought, and so forth, which are included in and so on in that first line of the verse, reflect on this saying or thinking, these results of the bad actions committed in the past by the force of degenerating my pledges with respect to the Lama, not properly guarding my morality as I had promised, and not guarding my morality through separating from it and losing it, have ripened on top of the external objects that I hold to be mine. So it's kind of like, all of this that we depend upon in terms of our food, our livelihood, and so on, that can be affected by bad things in our environment that will have to, then, experience a lack of those due to the environment changing according to our own bad actions of not having upheld our morality and again, our commitments, our pledges to our lamas. So then it says, then meditate on taking and giving. Again, this is mentioned in a lot of these. This means that from now on, we should keep pure the morality that we, whoops, I went up instead of down, sorry, that we have promised, especially the pledges with respect to our Lama, without ever giving it up, even at the cost of our life. So again, pledges or commitments, oftentimes that's the words that are used in the context of Tantra, but even in the Sutra, the more general teachings of the Buddha, we do make levels of vows that we would be holding, and that would be the what are called the pratimoksha liberation vows, individual liberation vows, which are essentially the 5 lay vows for lay practitioners. And then if you take ordination, they would entail the vows of a novice monk or nun, and then the vows of a fully ordained monk or nun, and so on. So there are a lot of them that are included within that. Most of us only have up to the 5 lay vows because of being lay practitioners, or what are called householders. We're going to see this term later on in this one of these verses coming up. But then we have the Bodhisattva vows, and the Bodhisattva vows are, again, are part of taking tantric initiation, but they are administered within the sutra context. And there are 18 root vows that we don't want to break, the kind of root downfalls that we could commit. And then there are 46 secondary transgressions. Now, for all of those that I just mentioned, you can study those. You can study the lay vows, you can study the bodhisattva vows, and it's good to engage in some formal study before you commit to a lama who's giving you those vows that you're going to hold them purely. So again, do what you can to explore those. They are a necessary part of proceeding on the path to enlightenment. Um, it's not essential that you take the lay vows per se, but it's a good foundational way of avoiding, again, I'll just go through the 5 lay vows really quickly. Not killing, which to break the vow, you would have to kill a human being, and hopefully you won't do that. Though I've worked in the prison down in Santa Rosa and have worked with men who have done that. Secondly, we want to avoid stealing, and in that case, you would break the vow if you stole something of value, great value. If you steal like a paper clip or something, it's still a small transgression, but it's not breaking the vow. The third one would be another physical action, and that is to avoid sexual misconduct, more specifically adultery, or any form of a coerced sexual activity where someone is having sex against their will. But it's mostly adultery that is the one to be concerned about, where we are engaging in sexual relations with someone outside of a committed relationship, whether we're the one in the committed relationship or they're the one in the committed relationship. If we know that that's going on and we engage in sexual activity, knowing that, well, then we have broken that vow. The fourth one is the only one that has to do with a verbal action, and that's to not lie. And we break that if we tell a great lie, which would be to lie about your spiritual realizations. And we can break it or have a minor transgression of it by any of the other sorts of white lies or things that we might do. You should try to avoid those too, but you won't break the vow unless you engage in a great lie. The fifth one is the only one that isn't a natural misdeed. All 4 of those are naturally non-virtuous if we engage in them. The fifth one is to refrain from alcohol and intoxicants, and it's presented differently by different teachers. Some teachers will give you the vow so that you only have to refrain from getting intoxicated, drinking too much or getting too stoned or whatever. But the vow itself, again, there's a little bit of leeway in terms of how it's given, but it all has to do with not impairing our minds through having alcohol or intoxicants. And it seems that there's no kind of deeper way that that is broken. That is the only way it's broken, is when you do those things. If you do take the vow not to engage in alcohol and intoxicants, then you should refrain from even having a drop of alcohol, it says. Now, again, there are places in Tantra where you use alcohol as a ritual substance. And in those cases, you wouldn't be breaking it because you're going to have a different view of those substances at that level. But essentially, again, that fifth one is added on because oftentimes engaging in lots of drinking and substance abuse and what have you can cause one to impair one's judgment, and thereby you engage in more non-virtue. So that's the logic for that. So again, you don't absolutely have to take the 5 lay vows, but again, they are the basis of all Buddhist behavior. Now, they really are the foundation. When you take ordination, you take all 5 of those when you become like a monk or a nun as a novice. For the third one, in terms of sexual misconduct, you refrain from all sexual conduct, period. And that is how you take that vow when you become a monk or a nun. But as a layperson, obviously the expectation isn't that you completely refrain from sexuality, but rather that you refrain from harmful sexuality, which would be, again, adultery or any sort of coerced sexual activity. So pledges and commitments are really important to uphold. And that's why I said, know those 5 well, but also know the 18 root downfalls, the 46 secondary. I did teach a course at TNL that was just specifically on the vows. I don't know if it was like 13 sessions or something like that, where I go into them in great detail. Know that you can listen to those teachings. You can read a book by Geshe Sonam Rinchen called The Bodhisattva Vow. The FPMT has a short little booklet on the Bodhisattva vows that gives some brief information on it. But just know that it's up to us before we take these vows to really investigate them deeply. Then we have the pledges and commitments that occur in terms of Tantra. And in Tantra, you don't take any additional vows until you get to the highest Yoga Tantra. And at that point, you take what are called the tantric vows, and those you cannot study before you take them. So you have to have a great confidence in your ability already from having worked with the other vows that you are willing to take those on and work with them. There are books that provide commentary on them, and hopefully teachers that can do that. I don't know if there's any recordings of me having done that, because I have taught them to some people, but we didn't put them out there on the for public consumption because of the secrecy around tantric vows. And so just know that if you do make that jump to Tantra at some point in this life, that you will need to perhaps again have a bit of a faith in yourself to take on those vows at that point and to be able to uphold them. But again, this linkage between the vows, which again is maintaining a purity. All of the vows are about kind of purifying our actions, helping us to have the purest intentions and thoughts, actions of speech, of body, what have you. So essentially, when we think about that, that creates a purity that results in the environment being pure, and we don't have any of these sorts of cataclysmic things going on in our environment. But if we have damaged our vows, then one of these environmental results must be, again, that you have an impurity in the environment, if you will, things going amiss in the environment that would cause some level of suffering due to the effect on our crops, on flooding into buildings and what have you, all these various things. So, okay, so anyway, that's enough on that. Perhaps I will share one little passage from Thupten Chodron's book. Venerable Chodron's book is again called Good Karma. She says, one of these results of a complete action, like I said earlier, is the environmental result, the place we live in. Situations where frost and hailstorms destroy crops and livestock, or where there is turmoil caused by climate change or outbreaks of disease, are environmental results of karma. In fact, Venerable Rabina and I were discussing last year how this, pandemic is an environmental result. When we have a lot of disease going around in the environment, where even being in the company of other human beings can cause one to contract this virus or be a part of contracting the virus. Obviously, it's karma that is the main cause, but it can become a condition for that. This is an environmental result. We've all, in some way, created the environmental result to have this disease running rampant in the world to the extent that it has. Then she goes on to say, specifically, failing to properly observe our pledges and ethical precepts is the karma that we must have created in order for this to happen. This environmental result is the external manifestation of an internal process. Through our having again moved away from those things that are leading us to a more ultimate purity, that are about purifying our minds, we then experience these sort of impure results in our environment of things again going awry. Let's go on to the next verse. Was there a question? I'm sorry. I wasn't sure if I heard a question or not. Okay. Let's go on to the next verse. This is verse 37. Whenever we desirous ones are bereft of wealth, we don't get what we need in terms of money, resources to support ourselves, it is the sharp weapons of bad actions turning against us for not having given and not having made offerings to the jewels, the 3 jewels, the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. Now we should put effort into actions of offering and giving. So this is once more this karma that I think we did even see a verse earlier on this, the idea being that resources, things that we have in our lives come from our own acts of generosity. This is one of the very simple ways the Buddha taught karma, is to understand that all of what we've created in terms of every one of you has some measure of resources in your life. You may not have as much money as you'd like in your bank account, may not have, the ideal home to live in or what have you, but you all have, a roof over your head. You all have food on the table. Well, all of that was created through your past offering and generosity. And it says here, and specifically, not having offered to the three jewels. These offerings that we do, such as water bowl offerings, or even any foodstuffs that you bring home that you want to eat, you can offer them on your altar first. There is a little mantra you should recite before you partake of them, after you've offered them to the three jewels. But essentially, making those sorts of offerings creates a continuity of generosity. That's why they say it's ideal to do them every day. So it's been nice about being home. I usually don't travel with water bowls because I find I travel with so many other books and things that it's kind of hard to bring all of that along with me. But now that I'm home here for this past year, I've been doing water bowls every day, and it really does help to kind of create that, again, continuity of the practice of offering that is a means of giving, of generosity. Of course, we should also give to other sentient beings, as much as we can, give money to, during this time, for example, the food banks, and, where people can get the food that they need, um, that will sustain their lives, and, for their children and what have you, all of that. So let's go into what Geshe Jampa Gyatso says on this. But essentially, this is a very simple one, I think, to understand, is that we end up experiencing something very similar to what we've done. We get wealth from our generosity. So if we don't have wealth, then we mustn't have practiced giving enough. So therefore, we have to put effort into that practice. And recall that that is the first of the six perfections of a bodhisattva, because again, it is so important that we assure that we do have resources, not just to sustain our own bodies, but so that we can help others and use those resources well. So let's look at what Geshe-la says. Whenever we desirous ones are bereft of wealth, refers to the fact that, for example, many people, no matter how much they exert themselves in actions of business, profit, and so forth, out of a desire for wealth, enjoyments, and so forth for themselves, become bereft of wealth, ending up without anything at all through only faulty business arising. So, things don't happen with the business that you start, or you keep losing your job, because people, don't maintain your employment, or they don't pay you well, or whatever the case might be. All these efforts that we make to procure wealth end up falling apart, and we don't get what it is that we seek, which is the wealth to sustain this life and so on. And again, in a bodhisattva angle, to help others. But nonetheless, it says when this happens, we should think that this is the sharp weapons turning against us, of the bad actions committed in previous rebirths, of holding on to things with the tightness of rigor mortis, with this miserly mind that doesn't want to let go, without giving to the poor, without making offerings to the three jewels, and so forth, without, or through having come under the influence of miserliness. Then, once more, meditate on taking and giving. Think about all those beings who are starving right now, who are dealing with an inability to have the wealth that they need to sustain their lives. Take on that suffering and give them everything you have. Give them all your merit. Give them all of what you possess, so that it becomes exactly what they need. Then, from now on, we should put effort into making offerings to the three jewels, respecting the Sangha, giving to the poor, and so forth, without feeling devastated. So once more, I think this one's pretty easy to understand, but the idea is that we definitely have to create that type of karma if we are seeing that this is something going on for us. Now, it doesn't mean that you don't have to do it if you don't see that you're having these suffering results. That's why doing offering practices on a regular basis is really advised. Again, when we say offering to the three jewels, well, we have the embodiment of the three jewels on our altars, right? We have ideally on an altar, you should have a statue of the Buddha, which will signify the Sangha jewel. And then you have, it'll be to the right in terms of if you're looking, well, would be to the right if you're looking at your altar. I don't know, I mean, what you're seeing from your side. Anyway, what would be over on that side of the Buddha, to the Buddha's left, to your right, would be the stupa. which represents the Buddha's mind. So that's the Buddha jewel. And then you have over here the text, which would be a traditional Tibetan Pecha text or a Western text like the Heart Sutra or something like that. That text represents the Dharma jewel. So you have Buddha, Sangha, Dharma represented on your altar. And these are essentially also said to be representative of the Buddha's body, speech, and mind. And anyway, these are how you make offerings to the three jewels. Of course, we can also offer to the Sangha jewel, as it was saying there, to respect the Sangha, meaning the ordained Sangha that are representative of the Sangha jewel. Recall that the Buddha jewel is the fully enlightened Buddha, or that completion of all the realizations and all of the abandonment of everything that obscures the mind. That's a fully enlightened mind of a Buddha and everything that's entailed in that. Then we have the second jewel, the Dharma jewel, and within that are the scriptures. That's what's represented on our altars, but also the realization of the Dharma in the minds of those who practice it. The third jewel, the Sangha, is when we talk about it as a Sangha jewel, it's not just monks and nuns. It's essentially those beings who have obtained those realizations of the Dharma, who have them in their continuum. They're what are called Aryas, these beings who have a deeper understanding of emptiness through having directly realized emptiness. So essentially, that Sangha jewel, we can, by virtue of the ordained people that exist in the world around us, we can, make offerings directly to them. And this is a good way to support making offerings to the three jewels is through giving to organizations, monasteries, nunneries, what have you, or an organization like the International Mahayana Institute is the FPMT's branch that works with providing money to Sangha members, monks and nuns who need financial support. So again, any of those sorts of ways that you can make offerings, water bowls on your altar, as well as any other ways that you can, share what you have with others. These are very powerful objects for us. The three jewels are very important. Now, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't give to others, like those who are needy. The poor was mentioned in Geshe Jampa Gyatso's commentary. Those who are homeless, who don't have food right now, for example, very much important to give money to those who are directly suffering right now. And then, of course, any other ways that we are generous. It's good to be generous towards your parents if you have your parents still around and the opportunity to do that. It's also good, of course, to keep your gurus in mind. The gurus are said to be the most powerful object because they are the embodiment of the three jewels in our lives to a large degree. We want to ideally see them as Buddhas. We want to also see them as the embodiment of the realizations of the Dharma, and then see them as highly realized beings that would be the Sangha jewel as well. So maybe that's enough about that. Again, I didn't think I was even going to talk about it as much as I did. So let's go back to the slides for additional comment from Geshe Jampa Gyatso on this in his commentary. He says, in short, we should put effort into giving away whatever we have, free from miserliness. That is, we should train in the mind of giving and eliminate the close-fistedness of miserliness. If we do this in this life, in our next lives, our situation will be better. And even in this life, we will experience some result. They say, especially if we give to very high objects, the three jewels, as well as especially our gurus, that karma can ripen even more quickly, and could ripen in this very life in terms of the results that we would gain from those sorts of powerful objects in our lives. And then I like this quote. This is Geshe Ben Kungyal. Ben Kungyal was one of the Kadampa masters, and he was formerly a thief, And so it says here, he's known to have said, in my youth, when I killed others and stole from them, it was difficult for my mouth to find food, because he was creating such non-virtue and stealing from others that he actually couldn't, find the food for his mouth to be able to be satisfied through that partaking of that food. But he says, but now that I have given up these negative actions and am trying to meditate and dedicating himself to a more virtuous path, a path of offering, giving, what have you, the food can no longer find my mouth. Like there's more food than what could possibly get into his mouth. Some of the food won't make its way there because he has adequate food. They often say this about the Dharma, that if you dedicate your life to practicing the Dharma, the things will take care of themselves. Everything will happen for you because of the way you've dedicated your life to, uh, you know, giving to others in whatever way that looks like, offering to others, offering your time, your energy, your resources to move in the path towards enlightenment for the sake of those beings. All right, now we go on to verse 38. Verse 38 says, whenever those around us deride our ugly body, make some sort of derisions on the basis of what they see as unattractive, it is the sharp weapons of bad actions turning against us for having made ugly images and burning them out of anger. Now we should construct deity images and have a tolerant nature. So the idea here is that all of us, I suppose, don't feel like we're the most beautiful people in the world. I think this is very common in the West for people to maybe put themselves down, to think that they're not as attractive as what they would like to be. But we all have, some measure of attraction, and we all have some elements of us, I'm sure, that some people would find unattractive. So it's not meant to be, again, a way of, kind of making these sort of statements that would be making you feel any worse or anything. But we may have had, even earlier in our life, people who derided us based on how we looked or what clothes we wore. I remember I got beaten up by these guys at a school function. I was up at the fair and I was wearing these really weird jeans that were out at the time, and these guys started making fun of me wearing them, and I made some snide comments which I shouldn't have, and I ended up getting beaten up on the playground or something. But anyway, there are, in every one of our lives, no doubt, sometime when some people were casting some sort of aspersions on us on the basis of their assessment of, what we look like, or, our features, or whatever the case might be. Well, there's a cause for that. Again, the karma of having people look down on you in that way, to do things, deride you in terms of your looks, your body, what have you. It's from us having done things that created ugly images, or images that weren't as attractive as what they would ideally be. So again, they use the idea here of ugly images, meaning Buddha images. Now, as a practicing Buddhist, if you've taken refuge, then you shouldn't be looking at any images in terms of saying, that one's really ugly, that one's really nice, because that in and of itself creates a bit of that sort of karma. And we should ideally, even if we see like a little crayon drawing of a kid of a Buddha and it looks nothing like a Buddha, if they say, oh, look, I drew the Buddha for you, you should say, oh, that is beautiful. That's such a beautiful image of the Buddha. And they say even when you go into like a Tanka shop in Kathmandu or whatever, and you're like looking at various images, you should never say, oh, that one's really ugly, I don't like that. You should just say, oh, this one seems to be drawn by a more skillful artist. All the images of Buddhas are said to be beautiful. We should never hold that view that they're ugly in any way. But the idea here is that somewhere along the line, if people are looking at us and thinking we are not as attractive, well, we must have done some of that energy of creating unattractive images, images that weren't, again, maybe drawn in the right proportions or done things in the right way. And so that's the idea behind this. Again, nothing to become too self-conscious about, but nonetheless, the other one, burning these images out of anger. Of course, hearing that, even though this text was written 1,000 years ago, we can think about, the Chinese who stormed into Tibet, occupying it and destroying so many images, burning the texts, burning, all of the tankas, burning the monasteries themselves. Excuse me. So certainly we can identify with others that have created that and generate even more compassion for them, because they've created that similar type of karma. But the idea is that from our side, we want to learn how to, be more skillful in how we work with these holy images. So that's the gist of this verse. Excuse me. Might need to take a drink. So Geshe Gyatso in his commentary says, in order to enact others' welfare, a fine body is also definitely necessary. I mean, they do say that this is one of the ripened results that we want to have, is to have an attractive form so that others will be attracted to us. A fine body is not only taught to be a subdivision of the good qualities of fruition, but also, due to it being merely seen by other beings who are to be subdued, they come to have faith in and admiration for us. So if you have a fairly attractive body, you can, kind of make others a bit more enamored of you, and therefore a bit more enamored of what you have to say. So it is, again, one of the 8 fruitional qualities that are taught in the teachings on karma that we ideally want to create for any human rebirth, so that we have the ability to have a great influence on others in a positive way, of course. So that's the idea behind, in a more traditional way of looking at why we would want to have an attractive form. But I know it's been interesting because there's a lot of lamas that I've seen who don't necessarily have what we would in the Western world call a really attractive face or body or what have you, but they have this inner radiance that kind of shines through whatever the outer part is. And again, I'm not saying that they're ugly in any way. They're beautiful beings, but they don't have, again, our traditional proportions of the face and body and what have you. Even my teacher, Geshe Jampa Gyatso, I thought he was amazing, a beautiful being, but he would always talk about himself in self-demeaning terms in terms of his appearance and what have you. And that is true, again, I think for a number of lamas I've seen, but again, it's ideal to have something that people are attracted to, but whether it's the inner or the outer, any way that you can get to people is really useful. The fourth line down then, it says, in addition, it is also necessary for the sake of being cared for and so on with delight by gurus and others. So if we have a likable appearance to others, we can kind of be in their influence and they can help us on our path and what have you. Therefore, whenever those around us and others deride us for having the opposite, that is, a body that is very ugly, that is stooped or crippled, or because we are blind, have a bad complexion, and so forth, reflect on this, thinking, the truth is that this is the sharp weapons turning against me of the bad actions committed in previous rebirths, of making bad images, that is, not caring about constructing images of Buddhas, or although I constructed them, I did so, not so well, such as making them without eyes, with distorted faces, and so forth, rather than constructing them well. And it says also burning with anger, that is, motivated by anger at Buddha images, Dharma texts, and so forth. I lacked respect for them, and burning with the fire of anger, I said, burn them, or else I directly set representations of the exalted body, speech, and mind on fire. Again, I mentioned earlier, the one Lama that I received teachings from this text on originally said, don't think about others when you're reading this text as much as you think about applying it to yourself. But nonetheless, if it does help you to generate compassion for others, this would be good reason to generate compassion for the Chinese, right, who have done that, who took great delight in burning all of these images out of anger at Buddhism and wanting to abolish it, wanting to get rid of it in Tibet, what is now occupied Tibet. Then meditate on taking and giving, taking on that suffering, the future suffering of those who have done such horrible acts towards the Dharma and are experiencing those similar types of results, and then give them what you have to make them happy. From now on, we should make images of gurus and Buddhas, as well as print the scriptural Dharma. In addition, we should make them extremely beautiful, such as of fine quality, well arranged, and so forth, without anything bad. We should have a very tolerant nature and not make bad expressions at other beings even. So the idea is do everything we can to not create sort of ugliness in the world, ugly images, or even ourselves being ugly. They say, of course, when we have a mind that is very angry and upset, that our face gets really ugly, right? They say that's one of the reasons why having a patient mind that is not filled with anger creates a beautiful appearance. It creates a, very attractive, handsome, beautiful form, face, what have you, through practicing that. Because we see when we're angry, and everything's all tight and the eyes are bulging and everything's red faced, that's not such a very attractive image at all. In fact, if we see people very angry like that at a store or something, we do everything we can to avoid them, not just because of, their appearance, obviously, but their appearance is kind of a warning that, yeah, this is something not so beautiful in our world. So again, that's the idea behind this. Let me just end before we take our break with a little story that actually comes from, let me read the version of it from The Peacock in a Poison Grove. This is the earlier version that was published originally. It's got a different cover now, but mine has fallen apart. The binding is like, I probably should get another copy of it, but now I have it electronically as well. But there's a story that is kind of an interesting one where there was somebody who created a very ugly image in terms of the karma was there to have not such a beautiful, attractive appearance in our conventional terms. Again, we're not trying to make it into something absolute because there's no inherent ugliness either. There's only what we consider to be ugly in our conventional world. But he also had created the opposite in regard to his voice. So there's a story in the sutras. This is pages 148 and 149 of this Peacock in the Poison Grove. There's a story of a monk who had a very beautiful voice. His voice was so beautiful that elephants would stop outside his house just to listen to him. One time, a king riding on an elephant passed this monk's house. All of a sudden, the elephant stopped to listen to the monk, who was in his room chanting. The king had not wanted to stop and wondered why his elephant did so. The king then heard the monk's beautiful voice as well, and wanting to see the person who was chanting, he went into the house. What he saw was a monk with a very small, crooked, ugly body. He couldn't imagine how this could be the same person who had made such a beautiful voice. An ugly body and a beautiful voice seemed totally incongruous. Yeah. He asked the Buddha about this, and the Buddha gave this explanation. He said that a long time ago, after the passing of the previous Buddha, Kashyapa, this monk was a worker building an enormous stupa. He was tired and always complained about the work, and he was very negative about his job. However, when the stupa was completed, he changed his mind about it. Feeling satisfaction that the work had been done very well, he bought a beautiful sounding bell for the stupa. These actions gave rise to different results. Because of his ill temper about building the stupa, he obtained a small and ugly body. But because he later rejoiced in the stupa and offered a beautiful bell to adorn it, he obtained a beautiful voice. So it kind of shows again that, sometimes hard to get all of them lined up in the same lifetime, but, we have to try to create the causes for this. But again, we don't do it. So I want to be a great singer. I want to get on, The Voice and whatever, all these America's Got Talent. I don't know what all these, there's an American Idol, I think, yeah, where they sing as well. You don't say, I want to create all these causes so I can use my voice and become very popular in the world and make lots of money and travel all over and be taken care of and have homes in 5 different parts of the world. And you don't do it for those motivations. You do it so that you can then be pleasing to others. You might take a look in your Lamrim text in the karma section. In most of the Lamrim text towards the end, just before you get to the purification of karma and that, there is a whole little list of what again are called the 8 fruitions is usually what they say. And these are 8 things we ideally want to have as a human. Now, keep in mind that the way it's written in the more traditional texts, one of them is to be born as a man rather than as a woman. But in a more modern sort of reading of that Geshe Loden does, he says it's to be born with independence. Of course, if we look at what's happened through patriarchy through the centuries in this world, we know that there are many places, even in our country now, where women aren't given the same opportunities and same liberation and independence that men are. And so the idea is to be born without any of those things inhibiting one's independence. Whatever that looks like, whatever your gender is, it doesn't matter. It's whether you have that factor of independence. But keep in mind now, those 8, one of them is a beautiful form, a beautiful appearance. And why we want all of those is because when we get reborn as a human, we want to have everything in place for us to be able to benefit others most directly, to not have anything become an obstacle to that. All right, so it's about 7:04. Let's call it 7:05. So at 7:15, I will ring the bell and bring you all back for the rest of tonight's class. So, okay. So let's continue on with these verses. Again, we only have up through verse 45 that'll be in this format, and then we'll have like kind of 3 summary verses. Again, I don't know that we'll make it quite that far tonight, but know that there's not too many verses left that are in this vein of pointing out these various sufferings that we might experience and then kind of what we do to correct that karma. Whoops. This is one of those PDF pages that doesn't continue, or that has the verse in the middle with it continuing on to the next page. So this is verse 39 that we're looking at the bottom of the screen. Whenever, whatever we do, attachment and hatred arise in us. The afflictions kind of come up really easily, regardless of whatever we're doing. It is the sharp weapon of bad actions turning against us. Again, it's our karma. Why? In this case, it's for having hardened our intractable and negative continuum, kind of making our minds even more stubborn in their deluded state. Now we should rid ourselves completely of this rigidity, this kind of concretizing these afflictions ourselves. Of course, this verse just really points to the fact that once more we have that karma that is the perpetuation of these minds of the afflictions through the force of having engaged in them previously. That's the result similar to the cause in terms of our behavior. So, our mind experiencing a lot of attachment in a very easy way, or for anger to arise quite quickly, that's due to the fact that we've become very familiar to those minds. So whenever, due to our continuum having come under the control of the afflictions, whatever we do, we are unable to put a stop to the negative minds of attachment to our own side, hatred for other side, and so forth. It appears to be retribution for having in the past until now hardened out of selfishness our continuum made intractable by self-cherishing. Therefore, from now on, we should rid ourselves completely of the enemy, self-cherishing, that acts to harden our continuum. That is, we should eradicate it from the root. So what's being spelled out here is, again, that in this, as is the case with so many of our delusions, it's caught up in the mind of self-cherishing. Why do we have attachment to our own side? Because we don't like being the wrong one. We don't like not getting what we want. We don't like it not being our way. And why do we have a hatred for the other side? For the same reason, because we're clinging so tightly to making sure that we have things the way that we want them to be. The mind of self-cherishing has that mode of thinking, how I want things, what I need is more important than others. And we engage in a lot of these states of mind on the basis of self-cherishing. Again, the deeper root is self-grasping, grasping at an inherently existent person that's underneath all of that. But self-cherishing plays a very prominent role in the arisal of most of our delusions because of its pattern of thinking me, myself, and I, and then reacting out of that thought of self-cherishing to whatever is going on around us. So again, I don't think I need to say a lot about that one because it's pretty obvious. This is the work that, as I said, we need to do on the Buddhist path of overcoming these delusions so that we don't keep strengthening their effect on our minds. Verse 40, whenever, whatever we practice, we do not reach our objective. It is the sharp weapons of bad actions turning against us. Again, why? For having assimilated an inferior view, or I think in the translation that Venerable Thupten Chodron uses, which is from Thupten Jinpa, it's a pernicious view. Now, whatever we do should be done for others' welfare. And of course, the most pernicious view, as is going to be revealed in the commentary, is the mind of cherishing oneself, thinking that we're most important. So we should learn to be dedicated to the welfare of others, do everything we do for the welfare of others to overcome that pernicious view, that intractable view, that obstinate mind of self-cherishing that is in our minds so intractably. So let's look at what Geshe-la says. Let me push the screen up just a little before I start reading that. Whenever, whatever practice we do, such as meditating, here he points to meditating on the generation and completion stages, which are the two stages of practice in highest yoga tantra, which is, way up there, or accomplishing the Lam Rim, the stages of the path to enlightenment. Whatever we engage in, we do not reach our objective. That is, we never get to the essential point. We never really arrive at what the meditations and the teachings are designed to produce in us, like such as the mind of renunciation or the mind of bodhicitta or whatever. Why does that happen? It is because in this life and in previous rebirths, we assimilated an inferior view. Now, there are many things that can be included in that if we just say inferior or wrong view or whatever. And Geshe-la says in his commentary, with respect to views in general, while there are, in fact, many views that are supramundane, which are good views that go beyond the world, or mundane views that could be erroneous, there's no guarantee, but some views in the world are worldly views are erroneous. The view in this context is the inferior view that neglects others through viewing oneself as dear. That's the mind of self-cherishing. Remember, we described it earlier as, that regard to oneself that causes oneself to neglect the welfare of others. We put ourselves at the center of everything, and thereby we don't pay attention to the needs of others. We neglect their welfare. So think, this is the bad actions turning against me of assimilating the view that cherishes myself. Then meditate once more on Tonglen, taking and giving. And from now on, whatever virtuous deeds we do, we must do them solely for others' welfare, utterly unpolluted by the entanglement of selfishness. We need to try to get rid of that mind that is looking at me, myself, and I, and thinking it's most important to take care of myself. Of course, the Mahayana path, as we know, is one where we don't neglect ourselves completely, because you have to tend to yourself to become a Buddha. But you don't do it for the reason of one's own welfare. We always, again, are doing it for the welfare of others. So we have to overcome that mind of self-cherishing along the path, and not let it become so prominent in our lives, so that we can actually develop that mind that is dedicated to the welfare of others. So I did want to share a little bit for this from Good Karma here. Venerable Tipton Chodron says, pernicious views are wrong views we held in previous lives or in this life. They include thinking Dharma practice is unimportant, attaining full awakening is impossible, our actions have no ethical dimension, there's no cause and effect, to our karma, and being self-centered is useful to prevent people from taking advantage of us. This is how this mind of self-cherishing even sets itself up as being an important part of our welfare, is those sorts of views that we might have, thinking that if I don't watch out for myself, if I don't cherish myself, other people are going to take advantage of us. They're going to do things to, harm us and what have you. So again, these are just things that she points out that could be included in that category of pernicious views. And then she goes on to say, it also will refer to the 8 worldly concerns, which we're going to see also in the commentary on the next verse. These are, again, a manifestation of that self-cherishing mind with regard to desiring what is good and beneficial according to that mind, and avoiding what is harmful according to that mind. And of course, these are worldly concerns. They're only about the pleasures of this life. And then we have bad motivations in our actions and rebelling against our spiritual mentors' wise instructions. A lot of things that could also be included in this. But then Geshe Jampa Gyatso in his commentary, actually, he talks about, again, how it's mostly the mind of self-cherishing. But at this point, yeah, I think I will share this. I found it kind of interesting, and I thought, well, she shares it here. Why should I not, go ahead and share it with all of you? Again, this is a passage from Venerable Tipton Chodron. She says, by now, you may be thinking, can't Dharma Rakshita go easy on me for a while? Does he have to keep saying that everything is my fault? Actually, Dharmarakshita isn't attacking us. He's simply pointing out that the self-grasping ignorance and self-centered thought that we previously thought were our friends are actually the cause of our misery. He isn't blaming us, because he understands that these two mental attitudes are not who we are. They are adventitious factors that we can oppose and eliminate through cultivating wisdom and compassion. Again, the ultimate bodhicitta, that will be the antidote to the self-grasping, that deeper error. And the conventional bodhicitta, cherishing others in that way, will be the antidote to the mind of self-cherishing, self-centeredness. Then she goes on to say, in fact, Dharma Rakshita has full faith in our ability to abandon these obscurations and attain full awakening. For that reason, he put time and energy into writing this poem, these verses. So don't become discouraged when recognizing the machinations of our confused minds. Instead, feel relieved, because now you know what to do to bring about a state of lasting peace and fulfillment for yourself and others. So again, this is just her making sure we have the right attitude towards these verses. We keep hearing, this is your own stuff. This is your karma. This is your wheel of sharp weapons that you sent out that's coming back to harm you. And it does get to be a bit despairing. We go, oh my gosh, how will I ever overcome all of this? And why is it just always my fault? And this is, of course, our Western minds thinking fault. It's simply due to these factors. These factors are adventitious, like she said. That's why we do these texts, study them so well, and meditate on them, is because we want to remove those things that are completely removable. If the mind of self-cherishing and the mind of self-grasping couldn't be overcome, well, there wouldn't be much merit in her like rubbing our nose in it and saying, oh, well, here, look at how bad a person you are because all you do is keep creating the causes for your own misery. If there was nothing we could do about it, it would be pointless. But there's something we can, and that's what she's emphasizing here. So anyway, I thought I would throw that in because it was kind of nice for her to give that little pep talk in the middle of all this stuff. Maybe not quite middle. We're getting, close to the end of this section around the karma. So verse 41, did I go through? No, I'm sorry, I didn't go through 40. I have to go through 40. No, that's the one that we just did. Sorry, yeah, I thought that was the correct. So let's go to verse 41. Whatever virtuous practices we do, our continuum remains unsubdued. So even though we engage in lots of Dharma practices, it doesn't seem to hit the mark. Our minds are still sort of out of control. We haven't been able to really, acquire any deep virtue, what have you. It is the sharp weapons of bad actions turning against us for having given priority to the grandeur of this life, again, the 8 worldly concerns, being invested in creating all the happiness of this life and not putting our energy into Dharma matters, which is at least the happiness of next life, moreover, especially the happiness of liberation, the happiness of enlightenment. So it says here as the final advice, now we should concentrate on the desire for liberation. We should make sure that we try to set a much more lasting and definite goal for our practice, as opposed to being so totally preoccupied with the happiness of this life. I mean, one thing I might mention before we go into his commentary is that, a lot of people practice Dharma and then they get kind of upset thinking the Dharma doesn't work because their lives actually don't get that much better. And the purpose of Dharma practice isn't to make this life better. That can be a side effect. Again, we might see that things actually do happen more beneficially for us, or that we are able to change our minds in relation to all of the things that are happening in our life. But to practice the Dharma with the expectation that everything's going to go your way, that it's all going to be a smooth ride from here on out, isn't a realistic expectation. We practice the Dharma for one of the 3 Dharma motivations that I mentioned just a short while ago: a good rebirth in terms of the small scope, liberation, one's own individual freedom from suffering, getting off the wheel of existence, or enlightenment. If it's not directed towards one of those 3 goals, it's not Dharma. The practice of Dharma means to at least have a regard for one's future existence as more important than this life. And if we get attached to the comforts and pleasures of this life and think that we're engaging in all of this so we can have a cushy, wonderful human life right now, well, that's not a motivation that's dharmic in nature. So let's go to what Geshe-la says on this in his commentary. He says, whenever, despite performing many virtuous practices, our continuum remains utterly unsubdued, mundane, ordinary, and not at all special, that is, we fail to acquire virtue. We fail to make some headway in acquiring these virtuous results. Think, whatever kind of virtuous practices and so forth there were in this life and previous rebirths, by the force of keeping solely the grandeur of this life in my innermost heart, thinking, may I have happiness and pleasure, a good reputation, fame, status, and the like in this life. there did not emerge even slight improvement in my mind. It's due to those sorts of attitudes that we have these obstacles to developing our minds. Again, these are what are we often call the eight worldly concerns. The one that has to do with gain and loss, wanting and being attached to having gain, material gain, being averse to material loss, pleasure, always wanting things to be pleasurable and comfortable and avoiding any discomfort, and then wanting the praise, the fame, the being thought of well through people around us. All of that is feeding into that side, and we want to avoid ill repute, not having a good reputation, being criticized. And then, of course, that happens at a larger level in terms of our status in the world, being thought of well, having everybody like us, what have you, and then avoiding, again, a bad reputation, and so on, infamy. So again, that's the way that the eight worldly dharmas manifest, is that they keep us bound in these patterns that are not about future results. They're only about this life, the pleasure, the happiness of this life, and avoiding any measure of suffering in this life. So he again goes on to say, meditate on taking and giving again. And then from now on, without coming under the influence of the grandeur of this life, even slightly, whatever virtue we do should be done with a single pointedly concentrated mind with the sole purpose of attaining non-abiding nirvana. Non-abiding nirvana is another name for Buddhahood. It's the supreme liberation that is free from the bondage of the bad tendencies of the afflictive obstructions or obscurations and the obscurations to objects of knowledge. So this is what I was teaching on last night in the class here and for the Santa Fe Center for TNL, was that we have these two obstructions that the bodhisattvas abandoned to attain this non-abiding nirvana, this state of complete freedom, liberation that is, moreover, quite involved in the world as a Buddha. A Buddha doesn't just sort of check out and experience some sort of solitary peace. They stay engaged in the world to help all sentient beings. And they achieve that state of being free from samsara, but not falling into this solitary peace of nirvana. They don't abide in either of those. Rather, they abide in the state of Buddhahood where they can be a benefit to others through abandoning both of these obscurations. The afflictive obscurations are what keep you bound up in samsara. And of course, the obscurations to objects of knowledge are what keep you from having the mind of a Buddha that can be then fully dedicated to the welfare of others. So again, this is what we should have as our goal, to concentrate single-pointedly on the desire to attain enlightenment, that non-abiding nirvana, so we can then help all sentient beings to the greatest degree. So let's go to, pull up the screen share here. I think I may have had a slide or two to share on this. Let's see. Yes, from Good Karma. She says, Venerable Thupten Chodron says, when we are convinced that the glitter of the eight worldly concerns will not make us happy, it's easier for our minds to generate renunciation of psychic existence and the determination to be free from it, and then moreover, to go on to develop bodhicitta. Renunciation is the first step. Again, that's taught on the middle scope of the Lam Rim. It means we have to turn away from the pleasures of samsara, from all of our preoccupation with worldly concerns, and move towards the goal of liberation, meaning, again, at least to want to be free from one's own afflictions, the afflictive obscurations. But then we again go beyond that on the bodhisattva path to also want to be free of what keeps us from being able to benefit all sentient beings, which again are the obstructions or obscurations to knowledge, to having the perfect omniscient mind of a Buddha. Now, what those are, maybe I'll go into those a little bit later. I think they may even be coming up as part of the ultimate bodhicitta teachings. But anyway, know that there are definitions of what those obscurations are. Then she goes on to say, such a motivation makes our minds much more peaceful because instead of fretting about irrelevant things in this life, it is focused on something meaningful, which is, again, liberation, enlightenment. This motivation, obviously, must be cultivated with effort. That's why we study the Lam Rim and practice it, so that we can have that motivation and really bring that to bear in our actions, Remember, I've talked previously about Rinpoche saying that we should be practicing this bodhicitta mindfulness, being aware of that all the time. Same would go for renunciation. You always have to have that kind of awareness. And then to conclude this, she says, then if somebody criticizes or blames us because we've got that long-term view of what we're headed for, we don't care much because we're focused on liberation or on enlightenment. If you are in prison and want to get out, you don't worry about dust in your prison cell. Why? Because you're focused on how to escape. If you have these minor things going on in this life, they don't become so major because that's not your main goal. Most beings in this world are living their lives for the happiness of this life. You look at animals, they say that essentially if human beings live their lives with that concern, they're the same as animals, because that's what animals are worried about, right? I need to make sure that I get what I need in terms of food and protection and, everything, safety from danger, because that's all that they can care about. They can't look beyond this life. Well, if you have human beings that are doing the same, and I'm not saying, because certainly a lot of spiritual traditions do teach that there's something after this life that they often, as spiritual practitioners in those traditions, they are concerned about and putting some energy into. But nonetheless, I don't know that those traditions go as far as Buddhism does in terms of saying, look at all the pitfalls of getting caught up in all the pleasurable things of this existence. We have to at least develop some willingness to kind of let that go to the wayside. Don't be so preoccupied with that. If you have pleasurable situations and good conditions in your life, rejoice that you have them, but recognize that they're not the be all and end all of your life or of this existence. It's important that we always try to put our energy and effort, again, at least onto a good rebirth, but especially liberation and enlightenment as the more lasting goals that we want to be driving ourselves to achieve as much as possible. Okay, so let's go back to the commentary, see how far we can get in this last bit of time. We're going to go on to verse 42. That starts again at the bottom of page 16. Whenever, as soon as we sit down, we examine ourselves and develop regret, it is the sharp weapons of bad actions turning against us. Now, there's different ways that this is described. Even one translation called it despair rather than regret. But the idea is when you sit down and you're actually engaged in some virtuous practice and you don't feel good about it, like there's something weird going on there, you should be feeling delight at engaging in virtue, doing meditation and what have you. But the opposite is happening. You're having some level of a regret, and it's not a healthy regret. We never want to regret virtue. We want to regret non-virtue. That's a much more important thing to regret. So what is it the wheel of sharp weapons for? For unabashedly making new friends and flitting from one lofty person to another. Now we should be attentive to all in the manner of a friend. So it's kind of an interesting pairing of these, the karma of kind of having this mind that didn't stay with something, whether it be friends or whether it be teachers or whatever, but rather kept looking for something else. That manifests in our mind not being able to work with what we are tending to in our virtuous practice and actually get something out of it. So let's look at what Geshe-la says on this. Again, I'll move it up just a little bit so we have the whole thing on our screen. When at the time of practicing meditation, while staying in retreat, for instance, and so forth, all these virtuous things we might do, we examine our continuum, we examine our mind and what's going on, and seeing that it did not strike the essential point even once, we weren't able to get to any kind of real good results from our practice. Develop a regret that thinks something similar to, it is good to not do my commitments today. Because we regret that we haven't really, achieved what we wanted to or ideally would like to. And we might even regret that we engaged in virtue then. We kind of think, well, what was the point? I'm not getting any of these great results. So maybe I should give it up. Maybe I shouldn't even do my commitments. I kind of regret that I even got on this path in the first place. I mean, hopefully we never go that far. But we have this tendency when we don't see these results to think that there's something faulty in terms of having our engaged in them. But the fault comes from our previous actions. So as it says there, think, this is the bad actions turning against me of in previous rebirths unabashedly making new friends and flitting from one lofty person to another and the like. If making new friends is illustrated with respect to a guru, for instance, it is to it is to initially take that person as a new friend, a new spiritual friend, and request them for Dharma teachings and so forth. But then after not much time to act without any sort of consideration or embarrassment, toward that person, you disparage them and you flit from one lofty person to another. You go on to another guru, kind of find someone else who will fill the bill for you. You kind of leave them behind in the dust and disparage them. So it says then to flit from one lofty person to another is, for example, when someone who teaches emptiness, for instance, comes along, to then develop a liking for them. And then when someone who teaches the mind of enlightenment, bodhicitta, for instance, comes along, to desert the former and develop a liking for this new person. We shouldn't be like um, kind of a uh, going from one thing to another, being attracted to this and attracted to that. We should try to stay with what we know, if we see it through and endure and keep doing the work, will actually lead to the results. And people even do this sometimes with the Lam Rim teachings, right? They might hear some Lam Rim teachings, they go, "Oh, well, maybe this one sounds like the one I want to do," and they neglect all the others, and they work with that, and then they go, "Oh, but this one looks really interesting," and they don't even get a realization of that when they go on to the next one, and they just go from thing to thing without any real effect on their minds. So the final result or the final advice is do Tonglen, and then to think from now on, we should be attentive to everyone as if they were a friend. Now, again, this whole idea of like making new friends and what have you, it is mostly in the context of the Dharma that we would need to be cautious around that. But I think this goes for even our sort of being trustworthy and steadfast with the people that we have in our lives in a more mundane way. If we are breaking those sorts of relationships, we're creating a karma there that is going to have us to have faults in our sort of seeing things through, having the support that we need to get to the results that we're seeking. So in regard to that, I think many of you were here when I taught on the Bodhisattva's jewel garland. I think that was last year when I was teaching on that. Whoops. There it is. Let me put that verse on there, and then since I'm talking about that, and then I'll go back to read what Venerable Tipton Chodron says. You might recall this verse. It was verse 21 of the 26, 27 verses in that text. It said, "Be free of flattery and fickleness in friendship. Be steadfast and reliable at all times. Do not disparage others, but always abide with respectful demeanor." This is, again, this text, if you recall from when I taught it, is one of the main teachings that begins the whole Lojong tradition in Tibet. It's part of the mind training collection, the Great Collection, that this text that we're studying by Dharma Rakshita is also found in. But it starts with this wonderful text from Atisha, Lama Atisha. And he gives that same advice, to be free of this sort of fickleness, moving from one thing to another, not kind of remaining steadfast and true to the people in our lives. And especially, again, it becomes problematic with regard to our gurus. So here, let's look at what Venerable Thupten Chodron shares on this. She says this boredom, disappointment, and remorse that we can experience, that are the first line of this verse, are the results of being shamelessly fickle and clamoring for high status. Kind of keep going after something that looks more beautiful than what we had before, more wonderful, more delightful, more enjoyable. Seeking fame and recognition, we buttered people up in the hope that they would do something for us. But as soon as another person could do more for us, we deserted our previous companions and took up new ones. Took up with new ones. So again, the idea here is this can happen with our friends, but it certainly can happen with our teachers, and that is not so good. And that's what she talks about here. And she gives it this term, guru hopping. I sometimes call it guru shopping initially, but then guru hopping is what, after you've already done some shopping perhaps, but you're not satisfied with what you bought. And so you're looking for the next thing. And this is, she describes as forming a relationship with one teacher, but when that teacher doesn't tell us what we want to hear, we leave and find another teacher who does. In short, we don't know how to be a good friend to our friends or a good student to those who kindly teach us the Dharma. So again, try to, again, it's not to say that in our initial stages of guru shopping, trying to find someone who can play that role, that we shouldn't kind of keep looking for what we feel where there's a good connection, where we like that teacher and the way that they teach and the things that they, say and whatever. I mean, we don't, get into just superficial stuff. We're mostly after the Dharma. We're not after the person, but we want to trust that person with our spiritual progress. So it's not to say that we shouldn't maybe go from one guru to another to check out in the mode of guru shopping. But once you have sort of started to follow somebody and they're presenting teachings that they know and you know will be useful for you, don't keep looking around for another teacher that's going to give you something else. This often happened when I first met with the Dharma in San Francisco. Of course, in San Francisco, there's tons of stuff going on around the Dharma. At least there was when in the 90s when I was beginning my Dharma path. And you'd have like these lamas coming into town and everybody running to that one like a flock, and then somebody else comes into town and they run over there. And, it's okay in some ways if you're not really committed, but if you're committed on a path and you're working with a lama, it's a little strange because it's like, what are you looking for? Can't you trust that what you have is good enough? But we see how this plays out again in mundane ways in our world. This is what happens in relationships often, right? Somebody's not, they start seeing faults of the person that they've committed their life to, and they go, I mean, that looks a little better over there on that side of the fence. And that person has a lot to offer, or whatever, and you keep looking around trying to find something without really working with what you've already made a commitment to. That's the type of energy we're talking about here that you're creating, whether it be with friends, partners, gurus. And a little bit more to share on this in regard to that verse from Geshe Ngawang Dargye in his book on the Wheel of Sharp Weapons. He says, if we attempt or boast of practices we cannot accomplish because we do not undergo the proper training, we will receive this fruitless result. For example, we may take an initiation of Avalokiteshvara and keep the practice for a while, but then take an initiation of Manjushri and change that practice for a few months. And then after which we switch to Vajrapani. The three beings that are mentioned here are said to be the embodiment of the compassion, the wisdom, and the power of the Buddhas. So Lama Tsongkhapa himself is said to be like the manifestation of all three of these, Avalokiteshvara, Manjushri, and Vajrapani. But know that again, if you're doing that with your spiritual practice, just like a bee going from flower to flower without rather, kind of settling down, then it's probably not going to be very beneficial for you. You're going to create this type of result of not really getting good results out of your spiritual practice. And then he goes on to say, this way we shall achieve nothing. Ra Lotsawa from the 11th century, again around the same time as Atisha, said, don't act like the hunter. This is a horrible analogy in my mind, but don't act like the hunter who first pursues a hawk, then a fox, and then a musk deer. For that hunter ends up returning empty-handed, going after three different, they're after the hawk, but then they see a fox off in the woods and they go after them, but then they see a musk deer over on the other side and they go over there. But you never get any of the prey that you were seeking. Well, you will not attain Vajradhara. You will not attain the final state of Buddhahood that Vajradhara embodies, sort of the primordial Buddha. Cultivate the meditational deities and their practices steadily. Again, he's using a tantric reference to talk about this, but the same goes for our sutra practice. Cultivate the stages of the path and their practices steadily. Just keep doing the work. Go to the teacher, the teachings, continue to take their advice, continue to work with what you're hearing, and trust in that process rather than continually looking for something else. At some point, we have to stop looking. The shopping ends, and then we begin to rely upon a particular tradition, a particular teacher, what have you. Then we go on to verse 43. I think I've got time for this yet before we conclude today. Whenever we are cheated by others' deception, others are deceiving us through their actions. It is a sharp weapon of bad actions turning against us as retribution for our great pride and strong desirous hunger, the strong mind of desire. Because these are the two minds that often might lead us to cheat others, right? We think we are better than them, and so we can take advantage of them. Or we have this desire that causes us to want to use whatever means to get what we want. And so we end up cheating others through these two minds. Again, you can cheat others out of other mindsets, but these are probably the most relevant ones that get involved, is the pride that thinks less of others, that puts them down, as well as the out of control desire that causes us to do whatever we want to accomplish what we seek. So what's the advice? Now we should diminish desire with respect to all. Kind of get rid of our desire as much as possible. Again, we may not be able to completely annihilate it, eliminate it, but we should lessen it by having a greater sense of contentment with who we are and seeing our own faults, which would diminish our pride, as well as contentment with what we have, which will diminish our desire. We won't have that kind of mind that is continually seeking something else and then going about acquiring those things with some deception, taking advantage of others. I'll share just from the slides this verse that was cited in one of the commentaries from Nagarjuna's letter to a friend. Of all great wealth, contentment is supreme, said he who taught and guided gods and men, meaning the Buddha. So always be content. If you know this, yet have no wealth, no physical wealth, true riches you'll have found. The true riches are the contentment we have within ourselves. And that's, I can think, what's being alluded to in that last line, diminishing desire with respect to all. Just kind of becoming content with what one has and not, again, always looking to acquire things in a unhealthy way. Again, it's good to recognize that we don't have perfect knowledge of the Dharma or perfect understanding and acquire that. That's not, we should always be unsatisfied with regard to our Dharma practice. But contentment here is in regard to our worldly things. Because we see that that's what drives us again on that, those worldly concerns, is always wanting more, always wanting the things that that mind is telling us we need in order to be happy, in order to have a good life, and so on. So let's go to the commentary from Geshe Jampa Gyatso. He says, deception in that first line of the verse is deceitfulness, being deceived by others, or, and again, it means that we've done some of that deception ourselves if we're experiencing it. Others tricking us into, doing things or acquiring things from us deceitfully. Moreover, whenever by means of such deceitfulness we are deceived by others, reflect upon it, thinking, in previous rebirths, I developed very strong pride, thinking, for instance, this is kind of a weird quote, I am the master of the house, a stick is a spear. He explained that in his commentary, that we make false claims about ourselves, and then we can proclaim whatever we want. We can call a stick a spear when it isn't a spear. There's a difference between a stick and a spear. So the idea is just to use something that embodies that sort of prideful mind that thinks that we can say whatever we want, do whatever we want. And by virtue of that, again, we engage in deceitful behavior towards others. This is the bad actions turning against me, he says, of acting out of that pride and this strong, desirous hunger, like those who are able to take others' wealth without satiation and are known in the world as hungry, desirous ones, kind of the vampires of the world. And again, we all have a vampirous tendency to kind of take advantage of other people's situation through some out of control craving, or again, through a pride that thinks that we can just do whatever we want. We can say whatever we want. We can, use others in whatever way we wish because it doesn't matter, because we're better than them. So he says the advice, of course, is meditate on Tonglen, and then to think from now on, we should have little desire for and be satisfied with respect to whatever perfections of psychic existence there are. Again, there are no real perfections of psychic existence. This is just talking about those things that we do become very enamored of in psychic existence, the good things of this life. Be satisfied with what you have. Don't always, have this mind of craving that's out of control, continuously desiring more and more, better, this and that. I mean, this is not a healthy mind. It's only going to lead us to ruin. It's not actually going to create the causes for any lasting happiness or peace. So once more, I think we can see, in this, and as I said, the role of these verses isn't so we can see clearly everyone else and go, I see how that's going on for you, and that's going on for you over there, and what have you. It's so that we can hold the mirror up to ourselves and go, these are the things I'm experiencing and that I created, so I can correct my behavior. But nonetheless, because we're working with the Mahayana perspective, we can bring to mind the suffering that others have to experience similar to this, and others that create similar patterns to ourselves. And of course, try to work with that skillfully through the practice of Tonglen, taking their suffering on ourselves and giving them our happiness so they can be free from that. But it can break our hearts when we see how beings in the world are driven by these worldly desires, how, people can become consumed with them, where it's just their full preoccupation. Again, if we look at our previous president, we can see how many of these things drove him to be the person that he's been, that he's become. I don't know that he was always this way in this life. I don't know enough about him. But we can see how the quest for fame, for material wealth, for, people thinking well of him in a greater way, having what he would consider a good reputation. That's how he's perceiving it in terms of what he acquired from his followers, his base, and all those people that supported him, that adulation. And of course, we can see how there was also, in my estimation, a lot of manipulation of those people that is out of that pride and out of that desirous mind, that isn't seeing that this is a totally unhealthy way to go about acquiring, some measure of happiness in this world. So when we see it in others, it should break our hearts again, even if it's in people who we consider to be our enemies, people who we may, again, disapprove of many of their actions. We see that they are just like us in having these same patterns. And therefore, we can practice Tonglen with them as well. We can include him in our taking on the suffering of others, because we see how much he's creating the patterns of suffering for himself in future lives, how he is creating a lot of misery and suffering for others, and therefore will have to experience the karmic consequences of that. So I'm just pointing that out again, that if you apply these to others, do it within the context of feeling compassion for them. Don't do it within the context of feeling some sort of superiority, like, oh, well, that's not going on for me, but it's going on for you and you and you, and then we start pointing out everyone else's faults and we get really good at that, but we never hold the mirror up to ourselves and actually see what's going on inside. If we see those faults in others, we see the actions that others are doing that are non-virtuous, it should only become a cause of greater compassion. Remember, there was that quote, I don't have it in front of me, from Kunu Lama Rinpoche, who said, any being we meet has either realized emptiness directly, they've come to know ultimate truth and are on their way out of samsara towards liberation or enlightenment, or they haven't. Right? They are either ignorant of ultimate truth or haven't yet realized it fully, or they have. That's true, right? Any being we meet is in one category or the other. If they're in the category of those who have realized emptiness, Kunu Lama Rinpoche says they're an object of prostration. We should be paying homage to them, bowing to them, making offerings to them, because they are incredible in their realizations. If they haven't, they're an object of compassion. He says it's that simple. Don't make it so complicated. Every being you meet is either in one category or the other. Over here, pay homage. Over here, have compassion. So anyway, I'm kind of pointing that out in here because I think there is some value to seeing how these can be seen as characteristics, behaviors of others, but only in the context of generating even deeper compassion for them. Any questions or comments about what we've talked about tonight or on this text? I didn't see any questions in the chat box. Did anyone have anything again that they'd like to ask? So again, there are a couple of meditations that have been sent out that you can work with. There's the one on kind of cherishing others. I think that was sent out, the two on Tonglen. You can keep working with those, but certainly try to work with these verses too, especially if you're finding, like if you read one of these verses as we went through it tonight or in previous classes and you go, that's happening to me to some degree. Well, then try to work with that one and really try to see clearly how that verse is exactly what you need to be working with. It's the medicine from this text that you need to be taking right now in order to overcome that. But then again, work with any of these as you wish, because we've all had these experiences, if not in this lifetime, certainly in other lifetimes. So let's go ahead and conclude, and we'll begin with the dedication. So I think, Paimene, you've got the